Hello, everyone, and welcome to this UN Behavioral Science Week 2025 session on bridging behavioral science and data science in the UN. Topic we'll be exploring, we'll be terming, I guess, in our UN context, behavioral data science. We can unpack that a bit further throughout our discussion today. For those of you who haven't seen me yet throughout the sessions, my name is Mary McLennan. I am the Senior Advisor in Behavioral Science to the Executive Office of the Secretary General. And I also lead an initiative called the UN Behavioral Science Group, which is actually convening Behavioral Science Week this year. We're bringing together 46 entities across, 5 days. We're currently on day 3 of 5. And over 60 speakers from the UN and outside. So lots to explore. So as I said, we're on day 2 here. Tomorrow, we also have a session on advanced or different methods in applying behavioral science, so going a bit beyond randomized controlled trials and ways we can explore there. Also on some case studies in the expos taking place on Thursday and Friday. So lots more to unpack, and we'll put in the chat for you some of the links to engage with some of the other sessions shortly. Thanks for that, Timon. Okay, so a bit about the Behavioral Science Group. If you haven't joined it, I would encourage you to do so. We are over 7,000 members from more than 70 UN entities and 150 countries. So lots of interest and demand when it comes to behavioral science across the UN. If you're in the UN, you're very welcome to join. If you are outside the UN, you can also join as an observer and join some of our discussions and events, and also hear about what's happening across the UN when it comes to behavioral science. So check out those links that Timon shared, and yeah, join the group if you haven't done so. And then just to kind of bring us up to the bigger picture here. So there's the group at the working level, and there's also this initiative called UN 2.0, this quintet of change. So this is put forward by the Secretary General. These are 5 areas that he has deemed important for the UN to be really nimble and effective and really deliver on his ambitious agenda for the UN. So they are behavioral science alongside data, digital transformation, innovation, and strategic foresight. So look out for these topics across the UN. I think you'll definitely see some intersections across them in our discussion today. Okay, so the links you have already, if you check them out, you'll find some resources. There's the Secretary General's guidance note. There's also the UN Behavioral Science Review, which features case studies from across the UN geared toward a practitioner audience. So lots there to unpack, including signals of support from senior levels of the UN, and also some really practical examples. And then, of course, join the group and keep in touch with us throughout the week as well as afterwards. Okay, so we have a packed session today. I'm going to get right into some of the logistics here. So we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen. So you can there, if you don't have a question yourself, you can also upvote questions of your colleagues so that we can have a meaningful discussion today. So check out the Q&A box. You can put questions in anytime, and then we'll ask them to our speakers in the allotted time we have. Okay, so today's speakers, we're fortunate to have Professor Neil Lawrence, who'll be kicking us off. He's the DeepMind Professor of Machine Learning at the University of Cambridge, where he works on machine learning, but really in a real-world context. So he's also been the Director of Machine Learning at Amazon and has previously engaged with the UN and many other public sector organizations, but particularly his work with the UN and others have been in Africa. So he'll speak to some of that, hopefully. And he's been an active voice when it comes to AI policy and ethics. And he released a book called The Atomic Human, which we would encourage you to check out if you haven't. So after Neil, we'll hear from Rebecca from UNHCR and Cash from UNICEF to talk about their experiences with behavioral science and data science in the UN. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Neil.
Great, thank you, Mary. And so, without further ado, I'm going to talk to, can everyone see that?
Yes, that's perfect.
Perfect. So I was going to talk a bit about the subject, bridging behavioral science and data science in the UN, which I'm not an expert on, but I'll give some of my experience and why I think it's in a very important area. So, I know everyone's talking about AI and everyone's talking about data science and data, but the thing I want to focus on is 2 pieces. One of which is the attention economy and the other which is the nature of human capital. So what do I mean by attention economy? Well, we're in a world where increasingly attention is the scarce resource. So as we get to make more and more decisions by machines, data-driven decisions, the one thing that will only increase in proportion to the world population, which increase, I believe, is flattening, is human attention. And we can go back to this quote from Herbert Simon from 1971, which is about information attention. And what he's saying, what information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. And what it's highlighting is that in a world of attention, the scarce resource, in a world of information, the scarce resource is human attention. And that brings to mind the Human Capital Index, which is something I talk about a lot in the UK, which is why it's specifically referring to the UK here. It's an index the index I'm referring to is the World Bank listing of the Human Capital Index for 2020, which measures health and education. And what's fascinating about the Human Capital Index is it's trying to measure this, in some sense, this quality of human attention that a given country has. But what's fascinating about these new technologies, these AI technologies, is arguably they are causing inflation in the Human Capital Index, because as we get machines that can do more and more things that we used to think of as specifically human, then what we've invested in terms of education may turn out to be redundant. And the main thing I sort of want to talk about is therefore what that means for how we go about educating and improving people's lives within the era of machine learning, data science, AI. So I want to sort of talk a little bit about this notion of the productivity flywheel. So it's a sort of thing that business people like to talk about a lot. But I think it is related to what we think about in terms of global development. So the productivity flywheel, the idea is that you invest in R&D and research, and that enables technical innovation, which produces productivity gains. Those generate economic surplus, and that funds R&D investment. And that's almost like the sacred cycle of a modern innovation economy. But the worry I have is that when you look at the sort of things that people are asking for in practice, we rarely see those things being delivered. And we'll come to what some of those things are. And the alternative model that I'm going to be talking about today, which is very much inspired by the work, as Mary mentioned, supporting collaborators in Data Science Africa, working in a Pan-African context, is the following. Instead of the idea of constantly converting everything to money, what if human capital is enabling real-world innovation that creates efficiency gains? Now, what do those efficiency gains mean? Well, that might mean that a subsistence farmer is spending only 2 hours a day working on life-critical work and has more time to look at other things and do things that might secure their children's futures. But efficiency gains of some time. And those efficiency gains, often in the form of time, release quality attention. So what do we mean by quality attention? Well, from that subsistence farmer that may have learned how to do something in a better way, it releases time from them that they can perhaps share that with a wider community, or they might choose to spend that time in another way. But if they choose to spend that time developing human capital in their local area, then that develops further the human capital, and this attention reinvestment cycle, as we think of it, drives forward. And we think this is absolutely critical in driving the type of development we need, because without this, what's going wrong in the monetary cycle is it seems that the microeconomic demands that we have in terms of the demands we have in farmers or citizens, I mean, I'll show a few examples from the UK, but across the world, are not being serviced by the innovation economy, the technical innovation economy. And of course, there's an enormous amount of relevance and importance for human behavior in this area. So when we look at public dialogue, and try and think about human-centered design, what we see, and this is from recent public dialogue we've had in the UK, is that the public are very consistent in the UK about what they want from AI and public services. In particular, they want improvements in healthcare, improvements in education, improvements in security, improvements in social care. And indeed, if you go across the world, this is very much also what my African colleagues are working on in their own communities. But what's fascinating about it in terms of what we get delivered is we just get software like TikTok or Facebook, which of course has some advantages, but it's not what people asked for. And when this is just a quote from a public participant in the UK that is saying that we want AI to operate as a co-pilot to someone. So this is what people are saying. These are not experts, these are convened people. And what we're really interested in doing is how can we combine the quantitative data that we're getting with these qualitative assumptions that we're seeing in the world population. And what's the underlying problem? Well, the fundamental problem as I see it is that AI itself ignore the whole rubbish about artificial general intelligence. That's just eugenic rubbish. But what we have is a technology that has an ability to access data at a bandwidth that is sort of 300 million times faster than we can access data. So if you look at our traditional relationship with data as human beings, we have a narrow bandwidth relationship with data. And of course, that was a relationship that could be open to manipulation. So we've used classical statistics traditionally to ensure that we're not manipulated by data. So lies, damn lies, and data and statistics is a quote from the sort of middle of the 19th century, but we got around that through classical statistics. But now the challenge we face is we've added the machine to this situation, and the machine has access to a vast quantity of information, yet presents it through a narrow bandwidth channel to the human being. And I would very much argue that these are the problems of modern data science, or part of the problems that modern data science is facing. That there's a new channel for manipulation that is occurring when the vast amounts of data travel between machine and computer, and then that is re-represented to us by the machine. And we can just think of, I don't know if they're officially genocides yet, but the sort of things that went on in Myanmar or Tigray around social media, and the disruption that causes when vast quantities of data are fed to people through this narrow channel, and the potential for manipulation, whether intentional or accidental, means that human behavior is all over this problem. But then that's giving us this sort of new productivity paradox, because typically what we're looking at when we're looking at these situations, we're trying to quantify what the value is in each of these things and associate money with it. But when it comes to, we're getting closer and closer to the heart of the human, the nature of what the heart of the human is and what they want becomes harder and harder to quantify. So we end up shifting to qualitative methods. Now, that situation has just changed again with generative AI. So arguably what we're seeing now is a world where we have what I think of as the human analog machine. So generative AI, a new sort of capability sort of between us and the computer. Now, this is offering both new potential for manipulation, where the human analog machine might misrepresent the data to us or manipulate us through this narrow channel. I've put psychology here, but you can clearly see behavioral sciences in general is trying to operate across this link here. But this has two potential effects. One, it can put the human back in control of the computer, because for a long time we've been controlled by the computer or by what large tech companies decide to give us. But this gives us an opportunity to control back in that direction, but also an opportunity for new types of manipulation to be occurring across the channel. So just examples of this initiatives where we're actually focusing on instead of sort of going in with solutions, talking to people and training them in these techniques and having them solve their own problems, mostly for me is Data Science Africa, which is a bottom-up initiative, started in 2015. The second meeting was in UN Global Pulse in Kampala, so long relationship with the UN. But what's so important about it is it's a Pan-African network of Africans teaching Africans, because they are the experts in their problems. They develop the solutions. And when I do go, I'm there listening, supporting, of course, but I learn far more from my colleagues there than they learn from me, because they're addressing their own problems through this attention reinvestment cycle. So they release a bit of time for themselves by sharing lecture notes. And then once they've shared lecture notes, they can train each other in these techniques. And so the cycle continues. There's a nice old Guardian article about doing this. It's more than 9 years old, about Africa and the data revolution, and how with these technologies, we believe you can actually leapfrog where, for example, the UK is using mobile phones, modern technologies to have a digital infrastructure that is superior to our existing large physical infrastructures. We in Cambridge are very much following what Data Science Africa is doing, but within our own context. So AI at CAM is about doing the same thing to support science, citizens, and society, so our local scientists, but also I spent this morning with local councils trying to support them in their decision-making. We have a number of interdisciplinary groups. You've already heard, I think, from Anna Kohonen. So we've got so many groups, but we're mostly supporting them to teach each other and share information, just like our African colleagues are doing. So in conclusion, the innovation economy is interacting more directly with the micro demand. And what we see is those micro demands, such as the needs of an African subsistence farmer or a health center in Kampala, are not correctly captured by the macroeconomics of the innovation economy. And the way we're trying to address that is we're trying to sort of support those people by releasing what we think of as quality attention, working out solutions that are specific to their context and supporting those that are supporting them to deliver those solutions and share the nature of those solutions to others. Therefore, we're reinvesting in human capital to drive the innovation cycle rather than investing monetary capital, which is less sustainable. And as Mary kindly mentioned, I have my book, The Atomic Human, that talks a lot about these ideas. And this is the sort of summary of the epilogue, which is really trying to sort of say, this is my best representation of the societal problems we face, that we have large tech company solving problems a bit like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which are their chores. They are not society's problems. And the challenge we are facing is that when they are solving those problems, they're actually undermining societal mechanisms we have to try and address existing problems. And we need new mechanisms to ensure these amazing technologies, with the support of these big tech companies, can be deployed to address what we might think of as society's wicked problems, problems in health, social care, education, security, the things people genuinely care about, not just in those African countries my colleagues work in, but across the world. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Great, thank you very much for that. Really interesting context and background about how we can leverage what we know about psychology and behavioral science and try to think about how we can work better with machines. And okay, so I can see lots of claps and hearts coming through. I don't know if you can see that, Neil, but there are a few questions here. It's kind of, you touched upon it. I think the colleagues like to know a bit more. So about, so feel free, I mean, put more questions in the chat, colleagues, or about ones there. But there's your work in Africa, which people find really interesting. And particularly, you mentioned manipulation. So there's manipulation in general, but there's manipulation potentially in the global South or African context. Are there things that maybe we should be considering when thinking about your overarching thoughts and working in the global South? So maybe just some general thoughts on your experience in Africa.
Well, I think the power asymmetries are extreme.
Mm.
I mean, absolutely extreme. And very often there I'm thinking, so when you think about, we had Francis Haugen in Cambridge talking about, for example, in Uganda, the free availability of data through Facebook, which of course meant that most of the population were only getting their news through Facebook. Now, I think that the government has stopped that now. I mean, people on the call will know better than me, but my colleague Godliver was telling me that. And what's so interesting about that is these are decisions being made in California with absolutely no consideration of the downstream consequences. So it's not people necessarily being evil. They don't have to be evil. They're just clumsy and they don't understand context. And so for a lot of the answers are looking out for power asymmetries and trying to empower local populations, because their ideas about what their problems are and what their solutions should be tend to be a lot better. But then the challenge that we've seen, or that I'm mainly working on now, almost all my work is dedicated to this, is it's very difficult, not for them, they're extremely entrepreneurial, extremely innovative, but deploying digital solutions at scale often requires large teams of software engineers to understand how to maintain, explain, and sustain these systems. And it's almost, of course, when I was in Amazon, you know, the supply chain had more than 1,200 people maintaining it, right? An automatic supply chain with 1,200 people. So the thing that sticks in my head is if there's two African master's students in Kampala who want to have a ride-sharing system, I mean, this is an old example, there's already Safe Boda, but for Boda, it's a ride-share, a little Uber for Kampala. They can do most of that. They can build most of the software themselves, but can they build it in an explainable, maintainable, sustainable way? And the answer is typically no, because they don't have access to that software engineering expertise. So I think it's about building local capabilities, seeing where the gaps are. Sometimes those gaps are less clear. Everyone thinks, oh, we need to teach something else. But actually, we need to teach these fundamental capabilities like software engineering. Or the main thing we focus on is work out how we can support people to deploy software that needs less people to sustain it in the base case.
Super interesting. We had a conversation yesterday with Professor Susan Appy, and she echoed some of this from her experience in Microsoft, having access to all this data and resources when working in the global South, the challenges there. So
and the big problem is often when these large companies come in, they come in with all these assumptions. I mean, I've sat in meetings and it's so depressing. I mean, I won't name which big tech company, where they got in contact with me because they knew I was working with colleagues in Africa. And you end up in this situation when you have one African colleague who is the deep expert, or two maybe, who is the deep expert in the problem. You've got like 5, 6, 7, 8 people from a tech company who are trying to be helpful, but they have no idea of the situation on the ground. And they're constantly talking, saying what the solution is, and never listening to the African colleagues who actually understand the problem. And that just happens, so there's social power asymmetries, and that just happens at scale. And it's extremely depressing to sit there knowing, you know, I'm often the one that says, well, why don't we listen to what Ernest has to say? Because actually he's already done. this. And of course, everyone there goes, oh, sorry, yes, absolutely. Because they sort of forget themselves, as I probably would do in their situation. But it's extremely problematic because there's some sort of assumption that outsiders know and people on the continent don't, when it's totally the other way around.
Yeah, this actually segues quite well into the other question there about how might you suggest people in the UN or colleagues on the ground partner better with academia or the tech companies, let's say as well, to what would you say to those colleagues who are trying to maybe get in those conversations? What advice would you have for them?
It's extremely difficult. I mean, I'll give another example with a sort of major foundation that invests a lot in Africa. I was talking to my colleague who's extremely well equipped to deploy agriculture monitoring solutions, has a lot of experience, and she applied for a grant from this foundation, and they were rejected by the grant founding body. It was awarded to a US organization who then recruited her and her team as consultants to their grant, but didn't give them access to the data from their own country. And this is the nature of development work at the moment. And okay, I understand how that's coming about because people are nervous, large organizations are nervous of working with this as a new university, a new research group that's being set up and supported by Data Science Africa. And so people sort of assume that somehow they're not capable. But what the story is again and again, you go to a big supplier that doesn't understand the context and they fail to deliver, and they fail to deliver at much larger cost than if you had invested in the local ecosystem. So the problem is, I think very often the local ecosystem requires attention. It requires careful work and development, that very often job cycles are going round too fast. So when I'm in sort of Africa with my colleagues, and they're very often people who are there from large companies, they're often cycling through Africa on a 1-year rotation. So maybe at the end of the 12 months, they've just started to get the idea about how they should have spent their 12 months. But that's a repeat cycle for my colleagues there, who every time they arrive have to nod patiently and listen and watch them go through the same set of mistakes. And then at the end of it, the person would know what to do. And that's very often because Africa is an afterthought or a charity case or the focus of a development issue. But once you start realizing, oh my goodness, these people are at cutting edge, they're building solutions that are end-to-end, mobile network health solutions or agricultural monitoring systems that we can only dream of in the UK. They were well ahead in terms of pandemic monitoring or disease monitoring than the UK. I mean, like it was a joke where we were in trying to monitor where the COVID was moving versus where my Ugandan colleagues can be with their disease monitoring. And as soon as we realize it's a partnership where they have as much to offer, if not more, and companies engage with it in that spirit, then I think we're in a better place.
Okay, I think there's a lot here to unpack in the future as well. Maybe we can think about the role for the UN in this. We have lots of colleagues interested in behavioral science and data science and AI. Maybe we can think about a way of fostering these
conversations. And actually, I think there's maybe a lot for behavioral science. I know that there's less for the data science in terms of working out how to get those who do want to help, because the tragedy of this is so much of this is people trying to help, but sort of not knowing how to help correctly. It's sort of intervening in a clumsy way. But yeah, maybe behavioral science has a really great way, because it's also quite hard to explain to them unless they visited and spent time why that's problematic. But maybe behavioral science has some good thinking about how we can encourage the right behaviors in the first place.
Yeah, hopefully so. I mean, we talk about just generally the social sciences, understanding the context better and the people and having that empathy and all of those sorts of considerations. So maybe there's an entryway there too. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Neil. I know you need to get to your next meeting, but
yes, apologies, I have to drop off. I've got oddly, I'm going to see a community-focused bank, and you know, because like I say, so much of what we're doing just inspires directly how we try and approach things here, and it becomes, because you start realizing that these challenges, of course, in the African context, they're just distillations of wider societal challenges. It's not just in Kampala or Kenya where companies and governments are out of touch with what the people want. It's a worldwide phenomenon, and you get deep insight into how to do it better when you see such great examples from my colleagues in across the continent. Really brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being with us. Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay, so now on to our next few speakers. So come on, Cash and Rebecca, if I could turn on your cameras. Building on the kind of maybe more tech-focused discussion from Neil, but coming back to the UN side where we're working on things in the UN. So a few questions for both of you. So the first is, why does behavioral science need data science? Coming back to the more fundamental parts of this. And why does data science need behavioral science. Yeah, your thoughts on that overall from your perspectives in the UN.
Maybe I can do why behavioral science needs data science, and then yeah, the other way around. Cool. So I think for behavioral science, data science offers a lot of tools to basically enhance its effectiveness and increase its impact, and also gains us a lot of operational efficiencies. The two main areas that I typically see this being applied is in the generation of behavioral insights in terms of understanding people's behaviors, especially in a lot of contexts where we do have like a lot of data available. It can help us to kind of understand behaviors a lot more. So like methods like clustering or network analysis can help us kind of gain a lot of these insights than just like our standard practices. So a bunch of tools there that we can go into later on. And then on the other side of it is improving the way that we evaluate our interventions. So obviously a key component of behavioral science is the evaluation, but in a lot of contexts, evaluation is difficult for whatever reason, especially in the context that we work in the UN. And so how can we leverage public data? How can we try and redesign things? And how can we leverage data science concepts to try and optimize more nimble types of experiments? Thanks.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation, by the way. I think from the data science perspective is try to understand uncertainty and the complexity in different phenomena that you're studying, especially for us in UNHCR. Of course, like forced displacement is a super complex phenomena that is accompanied by violent conflict and climate and other exacerbating factors. So for us in the topic of computational social science, trying to model this conflict phenomena and trying to have some anticipation for humanitarians to take action on this conflict phenomena, predictions, and anything that they need to do in order for them to do serve or do the service delivery. Behavioral data science actually help us to understand or distill this complexity, right, on this complex phenomena. Also from the algorithmic perspective is like, because data science is based on rigorous statistical analysis and computer science modeling and mathematics in general. So it helps us understand a lot of the things on system dynamics, network analysis, and certain dynamics that are cultural approaches. So like anything that is social, which has a technical element component, so it will help us a lot for us to model that complex phenomena. And also finally is to interpret the results, right? Sometimes we have a model and we have a prediction, or we have something that we're analyzing, that's the result, and then how to be able to interpret that from a human perspective and to say like, why does the model arrive to this conclusion? What was happening in the variables? So that's something that's super useful for us on why is that we need each other.
Great. I think those are nice, great ways of thinking about it from both sides. So from Cash, from the behavioral science perspective, it can just really enhance our understanding of behavioral insights and also our impact, evidence, and measurement as well. So we talk about those are the two ways in which we kind of define behavioral science in the UN. So it can have a role to play in both of those. And then from Rebecca, I'm thinking from the data science side, just understanding complex behaviors, thinking about systems perspective, and also interpreting results better. So nice kind of laying us out, setting us out for a discussion on this topic. Okay, so going a bit, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just to complement the both those points there. I think also I just wanted to say that like a lot of this has like occurred organically, right? So much of data science and so much of behavioral science has kind of lent on each other throughout history. And we see this in like a lot of innovations that were developed in data science came from people with like backgrounds in psychology or things like that, and vice versa. A lot of data scientists have contributed massively to our understanding and our practices in behavioral science. So yeah, sorry.
So yeah, no, it's a good point to make. I mean, this is not something that's necessarily right. We talk about AI being this new and novel space everyone's trying to go into. This is something that's been going on for many years. Yeah.
50s research, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We had that quote from Herbert Simon earlier. That's yeah, decades and decades ago. Okay, so cool. So that's hopefully setting us up. Now going into a bit more of your experiences working in the UN and exploring this intersection. What from your side, how can behavioral science or behavioral data science, as we're terming it today, can be used in your organization, and how are you currently exploring it?
I had a mini presentation, and maybe Timon can help me put some of the slides, which is there are many projects, and Kash is saying you sometimes don't realize that you're doing a behavioral data science project until some of the things don't actually make sense. I don't know if at some point, especially if there are data scientists in the room or people working with complex data analytics, your models don't work in predictions. So maybe Timon, if you can help me put the slides, please. The models that you're trying to do, or there's still the complexity on that one? I'm not sure if the slides are working, guys, because I don't see them. Yes.
There we go.
Thank you, Simon. I usually we have, how do we work? Yeah, that one, if we can put that one. We usually have a humanitarian, in our case, a humanitarian challenge. I call it, I wanted to improve something like the supply chain in remote areas. I want to, like, do service delivery, vaccinations in this area, educational, you have a service to deliver. It's a slide 3. Thank you, Simon. And when you have that one, which is the problem for humanitarians, then you need to try to backward engineer what data do you have. If you could go to slide 3, that would be amazing. Thank you. In the slide 3 was basically how the framework that we use, right? So on the data, one before. So the data problem sometimes is try to understand why your model is not working and try to understand the behaviors and data sets that exemplify these behaviors and the variables that actually influence this behavior, right? So if you're saying I want to improve supply chain or education, so what are the things that don't make the kid to go to school? Or what are the things that are affecting our supply chain in this conflict area, right? And so what we have is you have the evidence base, so whatever you have on the data, the collection of the people that you're trying to serve, and some of the behaviors. Some of this data might come from your own agency, but some of the data actually comes from other agencies, other actors, and even academia, right? And then you have this combination of people like Kash and I, which are like the technical translation support, I call it the interpreters, which is are coming back and forth with like, okay, this is what I understood from the education team. So the field-based teams, the country operations are key for us to do our work, key, because they would understand way better the behaviors and the things that are happening for us to model, especially the predictive models are not working. People with specialized skills, so that's appealing to the questions on how do we do partnerships, and I'm going to deep dive on that one and another one. It's that we come back and forth with some of the academic partners or other partners, private sector in some cases, for helping us to do these models. And in a concrete example, next slide, please. We work, and this is 2020, guys. So it was March 2020 when nobody actually knew what was happening, and we got the support from Bangladesh when they were like the field team, Cox's Bazar specifically, they were telling us they're about to close all the settlements, especially the schools, and we don't want the kids that have already been out for 1 year out of the school. We don't want, so we don't have anyhow or any way to prove that maybe with mask or social distances, or maybe with mask and not a school closure, we can continue for the kids to be in school, right? And so the humanitarian challenge was to give evidence to the humanitarian teams, country, like the coordination team and also the government. And like, what could be if we did certain measures or not, then they could actually, curb the infections. And the data problem is that you're dealing with like almost a city of 720,000, 725,000 people with a high population density of like the city of New York. So any spread to convince them was like, okay, how can we model? So in this one, we went not with the normal infection modeling diseases that the majority of them were doing in 2020, and we had a multi-partnership, multi-stakeholder partnership approach with private sector, which is IBM Watson team, and of course, the University of Durham, the computational social science team there, and UN Global Pulse, who was leading us on that one. And I'm presenting this because I think it's very important to have this multidisciplinarity. And we built an agent-based modeling. You're seeing the Giphy of the agent-based modeling, a digital twin to try to see the interactions of the refugees, forcibly displaced people here in the camp, aligning it with our household data, because household data is not enough. We work with the field teams to actually understand their interactions with the day. How many times do they go for food? How many times do they go to the latrines? How many people are going to the latrines at this moment? For us to understand social distancing and the measures and see what can actually curb or not the infection modeling. And we use June framework, which is a computational social science framework. So it's computer science in this case to build that specific. And then the next slide, please. The one that we're working today, similar, not similar, it's again agent-based modeling. Agent-based modeling is one of the strong data science methodologies And by the way, June framework is using AI, algorithmic decision making, on what would be the probability or possibility and prediction if a person moves into one part to the other to have the disease. This one is also using AI, but it's not AI that you imagine, like chatting with ChatGPT. It's linear regression modeling, right? So, and with the regression modeling and prediction, like a flea of Brunel actually went forward, and that's why in some of the cases the predictive models don't work. So agent-based modeling is actually trying to, like, understand the interactions. For Ukraine, it's ongoing work between Brunel University and our Europe regional team to try to understand, again, the humanitarian challenge is if Ukrainians return to their countries, what are the things or the sectors that are going to be impacted, the services, the accommodation that they need. So that's the policy work that they need. For the data problem is we have different sociodemographic profiles, different ties to Ukraine. For example, some of them have family, some of them have property, and that would impact the regions where they're fleeing or actually returning to. And then also different needs and capacities, right? So that it's ongoing work because they're developing the prototype, but again, it's using different computational social science models for us to be able to model those behaviors, knowing that there are different social variables that we need to take into consideration. And finally, the next slide, just to wrap up, this one is what are novel areas where we see behavioral data science. We can use AI or not, and in some cases, actually, AI is used for cleaning the data that we need to analyze because they could be thousands and thousands of data sets. One of them is people outreach and understanding their needs. So I'm talking about participatory assessment, needs assessment, call center logs, things that are text-based, sometimes messaging app logs, etc., which are per minute, per second in some cases, right? So that might need some work, right? But that's actually is deriving from behavior, where they're expressing the needs and how do we need to attend to that need. The other one is financial transactions, identity management related process, which also can come by the minute or by the second. A lot of your back office teams are dealing with those transactions, unless you're doing cash-based assistance, which is life-saving delivery. In the life-saving delivery, health, education, cash-based assistance, a lot of the humanitarian sector, settlement, mapping, planning, etc., that also can be combined to combine behaviors on how those services are interacting and what the users think about the services. Urban settlements and service planning, so that's on urban design. Cities, things that are related in our case for settlements or camps, it could be in urban settings, but also in rural settings. And disaster reduction, environmental and climate change, because there are also variables that are cumbersome, that are actually not in the formats that you like, which is text-based generative AI. Data is usually on linear regression modeling and stuff, but when you have GIS mapping, TIF files, audio recordings for call centers, it is when you actually start to log in a bit on the behavior that in order for you to do these things. So this is what we're seeing in the humanitarian sector, but I'll ask for Cash to explain what's UNICEF doing. So that's it. Thank you so much. These are some of the examples that we have worked with.
Cool. Let me.
While Cash is pulling up his slides, thanks, Rebecca. We have a few questions for you in the chat, so we'll get to those afterwards. But yeah, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll have some time at the end to go through them.
You want to go through those questions for Rebecca first? Or?
Sure, maybe we can get some these are some clarifying questions. So you can see, Rebecca, there's like demand to know more about disaster risk reduction in particular in that space, where potentially this behavioral data science can particularly play a role. And then also, particularly in cleaning data and data management, people are curious to hear more about how you do that. People are asking about apps, but it could be other ways you do it as well.
Yeah, I code, so I use open source Python, but if you're not an advanced analytics, there's many ways that, for example, I've seen some of the colleagues from what we call the IM officers, they are data analytics team, and they use Power BI, which is Microsoft suite. So if you have Microsoft in your agency, Power BI, the DAX, I would say language, helps you to clean some of the data sets that are not, so there's suggestions. And if DAX is not still enough because it's super complex, then usually a lot of people that I've seen, they use Copilot or with DAX at the same time in Copilot on the cloud for their own agency, for their protection. But it's usually what we do is we clean our own data with Python or R. especially when they're big data sets. That's open source will be very helpful. But there's many software, a lot of others, run other things in a warehouse. So we have teams with like massive data sets when they have like specific things on, and they contract their own companies. There's many solutions, but if you're doing it on your own and you don't know how to code, maybe Power BI is the first one, and then you can take a couple of mini courses in our Ever Learning YouTube, which is like how to clean the data for this. On disaster reduction, great question, because this is something that we deal a lot in forcibly displaced situation, which is the movement is exacerbated by climate change or like weathers that are changing phenomena. I didn't speak about it, but we encountered this in Project Jetson, which was trying to anticipate internally displaced in Somalia. And one of the things, and that's the model was not working, and one of the things that actually they talk about was on how climate, the drought specifically in this case, was a factor for them to decide where to go or not, right? So this is when disaster reduction, and which is more on the classical, I would say, development, which is also now very popular with humanitarians, because we're seeing that some situations of conflicts actually have been exacerbated by climate and disasters, right? Or we have the ultimate combo, which is a natural disaster with a conflict and also already protracted crisis of environment, right? So that combo is deadly. And trying to understand in the rapid movement for us in humanitarians is what the immediate response, displacement in our case, no? Violent conflict. But if we in the multidisciplinarity that we need to form in behavioral data science, maybe I need someone with disaster reduction and with ER like expertise to explain me why are they selecting this area that is super arid, and maybe it's that in sociologists in some cases would say, oh, because they don't cross the line against the other tribe, right? But in some cases, like, yeah, nevertheless, that the area is arid. The only thing that they do for livelihood is this commodity, and maybe this is the only place where they can put it. And so you're going to have all the population in an area that for you as data scientists doesn't make sense. But for them, they make sense because they know about the land and the erosion of the land. So that's something that it's important. Why and how to get involved? This is a lot to have is a combination of food security data, a combination of like satellite imagery on, disaster areas before and after, floods, droughts. That's something that we are also very interested, and things that are having a trigger in another sector, right? So if something is affecting the health sector, the education sector and stuff, that's something that this is where you get in behavioral data science, because it affects human behavior and decisions for them to move, to take classes, to go and build their own shelter, So that's that. I don't know if that answered the question for the DR teams.
Yeah,
We really need you guys.
that was good. We got some hearts, and I think it's a huge question to answer in a few minutes there. I'd just also like to point, if colleagues are interested, in the opening session on Monday, we heard from SRSG Kamal Kishore, who's the head of the UN Disaster Risk Reduction, and he spoke about this, and he spoke about some of the work also. Microsoft AI for Good was there, who's also done some work in this area. So if you want to check out that opening session, there are some remarks there that will go a bit still high level, but we'll get you a little bit more too. Okay, cool. Next, over to Cash from his perspective in UNICEF. How are you looking into this behavioral data science and the work that you do?
Cool. Yeah, so this kind of relates to my earlier answer on like the areas in which data science can be applied to behavioral science can be applied, or data science can be applied to behavioral science, and whichever way you want to see it. So I've categorized them along those kind of lines. So I'm just going to quickly talk about a few examples of how we're doing it at UNICEF. So firstly, about generating insights about behaviors. So for example, as I mentioned, clustering algorithms to generate personas. So often we collect data on the community to understand behaviors, to understand attitudes and things like that, but we typically only just look at the averages. But when you apply clustering algorithms, then you're able to identify these different classes and different clusters or personas, and then that helps to inform you either for targeting, so then you can like identify where the people that will change the most or the people that are most vulnerable, and then you can direct your resources towards that, or it's at least to help you understand it might help inform like a personalized interventions, as we saw with the discussion with Professor Athi yesterday. The other area is related similar to what Rebecca talked about, which is agent-based modeling. However, one of the issues that we have is like in emergency settings, you need to quickly gain understandings about people's behaviors, about their attitudes, about their insights around the emergencies and stuff like that. And one of the big challenges is that we need to collect data quite quickly to be able to gain those insights. And if you've ever tried to go through a UN procurement process, it takes a while. It's very hard to go rapidly collect data. And typically what happens is that we just have our own staff trying to collect data, but it ends up being very small samples with, and we tend to overgeneralize a little bit because that's the best that we can do. Like it's not an issue with it, but it's the best that we can do given the state of emergency. So instead, what we try to do is combine agent-based modeling with generative AI to try and run some simulations about what those attitudes might be, how the people might behave, how they respond to certain types of interventions, or even RCC, risk communication messages, things like that. Next, it's on the effective programming or operational implementation. So, for example, we have a project, again, for emergency settings where we're trying to quickly understand like what messaging would be most effective to encourage people to adopt protective behaviors. So we developed this process together with University of Chicago, where we crowdsource messaging from the community quite quickly through some of the platforms that we already have, like UReport, which is built on Rapid Pro. So we immediately engage with communities to understand what their perceptions of the issues are and what messages they feel is most effective. We feed that into an LLM to extract hypotheses about these, and then using those hypotheses, we generate new distilled messages, which we then send back to the communities, get them verified, and then we can use that to quickly then deliver these emergency messages to encourage people to adopt protective actions. On the other side here, so we're working with Sistema Futura to develop this computational systems approach to inform the design of multi-sectoral programming. So, a lot of the work in the UN, generally, like we end up working in silos. Everybody recognizes the importance of multi-sectoral programming, but it's quite a challenge because of various reasons. It's quite a challenging approach to do. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to combine behavioral science, which sees behaviors at the center of many of these different sectors, but then we also combine that with computational systems approach so that we can see all the different factors that lead or like that drive that behavior, so that then we can help to inform the planning of our country offices to design and implement programming where other sectors know exactly what to do to maximize the output, right? So rather than acting in silos, they can run simulations of where they should be directing their interventions and by how much and these things. Yeah. And then finally on evaluations, so as Rebecca mentioned, GIS data awesome helps to drive your decision making so much. So even when designing evaluations, designing experimentation, like because we often work in a lot of these different contexts, so like GIS mapping helps us to either something as basic as like stratification before you do your randomization, right? So just being able to know what the distance between villages to health facilities are in case that's a strong variable. So GIS mapping helps us to kind of understand that how people live in regards to health facilities or other services, and then it helps you design the evaluations in that way. And then pretty basic stuff like synthetic controls. So in a lot of contexts, we might have admin data, but running experiments is tricky, randomizing is tricky, so for various reasons. So then we can do things like synthetic controls, where we then target just one county, and we might use data from all the other counties to generate a synthetic control to act as the counterfactual. And then also tons of other examples, for example, from Professor Appy on like using reinforcement learning for adaptive evaluations to test lots of different things without needing to go through the entirety of the process of running an evaluation to extract the learnings. Cool.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Cash. I think there's a lot there to unpack together. So maybe, okay, there's a question for you, but I'm gonna add on a little bit. So the idea of synthetic controls has come up quite a bit in conversation we're having across the UN, and the idea of it, sort of not necessarily that people are doing it everywhere across the UN, just that people are discussing it. So I just might be helpful to say a little bit about that, but I'll maybe, if you have time. Other questions from the audience, though, are, could you tell us a bit about fuzzy cognition maps, what they are, and knowledge ring fencing? We're going there, so we're going on that level, but then also in the use of GIS data, how else can, outside of the example you gave, like with the image you showed, how else can GIS data be useful? So maybe it's also for Rebecca too, of how, just more generally thinking about types of data that we have access to and why we can use them. So yeah, could be a bit on synthetic control slightly, if you can, a little bit more, but then also to get colleagues' questions. What are fuzzy cognition maps?
What was the specific question about synthetic controls?
I was thinking, it's come quite a lot, and I think
Okay.
there's not
Data
always an understanding of what it
protection,
is. So you did a good
Oh,
job
okay.
there, but just more kind of
Okay.
like
Yeah.
laying out what it is and how it might be useful or not useful, just very briefly. Yeah.
Okay. So generally, when we're trying to do evaluations, we're trying to create a counterfactual. And that's why we randomize, right? Because randomization essentially kind of creates that counterfactual in some ways. Randomization is obviously tricky for political reasons, for operational reasons, whatever. However, in some situations, you might have time series data, historical data, right? Let's say like health facility data of like rates of immunization or rates of diarrhea reports or whatever, right? You can use data from all the other areas in a country. So let's say we're talking about counties, right? We target our intervention in one county, but all the other counties have all this historical data. We can use those data. We can use the historical data to basically add weights so that they emulate the target county that we're doing. And then you deliver the intervention and you know what it would have been like without it. And then in the post-intervention period, you basically re-add those weights to all those different counties, and they essentially act as the counterfactual for the intervention. That was my super quick. I hope that did.
Great. I think that's perfect. Just a little bit more there. But yeah, but back to questions to colleagues. So if you want to give a little bit, again, as much as you can, there are lots of questions coming now, but fuzzy cognition maps, ring fencing, and then GIS. Yeah.
Fuzzy cognition maps is essentially just a systems map of cognition. So the entire system of how people make decisions around a specific area. That's like the surface level description. I can spend a lot more time talking about this, but and then the other one, sorry, what was the other one?
Knowledge ring fencing.
So big issue with using LLMs in an African context is that LLMs weren't trained on African context data, right? So when you're trying to implement it here, you have to make sure that you're not just introducing a whole load of bias from Western context into this. So you want to like ideally fine tune it with a bunch of data that you generate locally that's very relevant to that. But you also want to ring fence your LLM to ensure that it's not going to introduce a bunch of that Western bias. Yeah, that's the simple.
Great. Okay, cool. Thanks for that. We can do a session on methods and all of this at some point. Maybe let's go into
more than happy to go.
Yeah. Into this. I think Rebecca and Cash are well placed for this. Okay, so there's also a question on just GIS data in general. How can it be used to better understand human behavior? So maybe some other examples or, yeah, your thoughts on GIS data overall. Maybe Cash and Rebecca.
Rebecca, please.
Well, okay, GIS, go for it. First is usually on planning, for example, for settlements or urban settings, the whatever service delivery that you're doing, sometimes having extra data on, example, we use for call detail records at some point, and this is a combination, and it's a super sensitive data set, so you need to sample it. Like if you get your hands as an academic researcher on that one, then you need to anonymize, do a sample. Actually, we just get samples usually from the mobile network operators, and afterwards you extrapolate, a map for you to see where is the concentration of population, and maybe you can actually you overlap the GIS layer to see where the services are, for example, and you see, okay, the population is here, but we don't have services in this area, so you know that one isn't covered. This is for urban settings, so it's usually to allocate service delivery. You need to understand the behaviors of the population around if they are willing to go to that school or to that clinic, etc., etc. In rural areas, the typical one is climate and weather events. So usually like floods, or actually that's also in urban. Floods, as you can see literally right now in Congo, in urban settings and rural settings are super destructive. So by having a violent conflict, which is our favorite one, so mass graves, things that you're doing for some investigations, and you need to try to understand why it happened, what it happened, and try to understand the behavior and like where were they. So in forensics, useful also you can use for human rights investigators, and yeah, climate and weather. So urban planning, rural planning, settlement, climate, weather events, and human rights. That also you need also for behaviors. So hopefully that answered the question on GIS. And you can overlay, of course, with text-based data and quantitative variable, categorical and numerical.
Yeah, maybe the other thing is that's great. If you have any examples, Rebecca, it sounds like you've used GIS data quite a bit. Any publications or things you have, maybe it would be good to share those in the chat with some
Yeah,
colleagues
I
who can
can share in the chat
read a
for
bit
sure.
more about them, because I think that's
Yeah.
a good one. Cash, did you want to comment on GIS data or another question? Should we go?
Yeah, that's no, I don't think I can top that.
Okay, like Rebecca covered a lot there. I feel like it's a little infinite amount of spaces you could think about with GIS data.
No,
It's
but
like,
it's so difficult to, to process,
Yeah.
even to data share with someone like non-partners. How do you share? It's massive data, guys, for computer vision. So it's like, what server can you use to store it, to build models, no? So we have one, like the link that I'm going to say is at Grapper. So in order for us to have GIS data, what you really need to build with a bit of AI is a cutting app that we built. So you can download, but I don't know if
Okay.
it's working. So that's the link that I'm going to share.
No, that'd be great. I think it's also really helpful to understand this data looks great in practice. Cash's little image there of all these data points looks great. Lots of intuitive things you could do with it, but to Rebecca's point, there's a lot you have to think about how to access data, use the data, and all of that too. So, yeah,
Data
okay.
cleaning is like 80% of the work most of the time.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So there's also some questions here about problems and opportunities about scaling or automating, I guess, data science and simulation. So the approaches you're talking about, how do we scale these, make them more automatic? Is it possible to do this? What would be needed to like really use these approaches more in organizations across the UN? You both are trained in this space, you've worked in this space for a number of years. How do we make this scaled across the UN, this behavioral data science? What do we need? What are your thoughts on making it more accessible, usable?
I don't know, accessible. Yeah, that's a hard question.
Or
I would
just more embedded, maybe, or just more
to
used?
be able to do more behavioral data science. If I can answer that question, for me, it's investment in data infrastructure and data, just having data. And I think this is especially relevant for behavioral science, where, in talking about GIS mapping, right? Like we have satellite data, we have like operational data, we have a lot of things, but often in a lot of the data collecting activities that we have in general, that's continuous, that's regular, there's definitely a lack of like behavioral data that's regularly collected. So often the big limitation for behavioral data science is actually having that data, right? Like especially in the context that we work in, right? If we're a marketing company in the West, easy, like any single user, I can look at your Google code, I can see all your interactions across the websites, I have tons of data on your behaviors. But we don't have that automatic data collecting processes in a lot of the issues that we work on and in the context that we work in. So that would be a big ask for me.
If I may, on this one is the first thing, guys, is we don't have we don't have all the technical expertise in all the agencies, and even in the big agencies, because we come from big agencies, guys, at least UNICEF and UNHCR. We're more than 10,000 people, actually approaching to the 20,000. And not even like in those teams, they're dedicated advanced data analytics teams. So what we rely a lot is on partners. And so usually, and in order to follow a bit Cash on this one, we like local partners because it's localization agenda is big on this one, because behaviors are on a socio-technical aspect, right? It's something that it's on the operational context that you're working in. So we actually work a lot with, for example, our local, what we call implementing partners, the NGOs that we work with. They have direct access to data collection in some areas that we don't, right? So if we don't have data, Cash, like we're saying, we don't do this modeling or anything that needs to be done. But for research partners, in some cases, I mean, there's I would say, prestigious universities that have the latest papers, usually in the global north. Sometimes even the local universities, and we're working a project with, with Iraq, exploring local partnerships with Kurdish language, actually, and LLMs on this one, to see if, to try to understand a bit on the behavioral side. But I think the importance of working with academic researchers, doctoral, postdoctoral, and even private sector companies, but sometimes we usually encourage to work with local startups. They usually know more on the operational context, and also you're encouraging the startup community to grow in that context, instead of, I don't know, using something that is from this perspective. And yes, you can try to, like the UN framework that I was telling you, we use it was the UK infection, and we try to use it in Bangladesh, and we need to tweak it and tweak it and tweak it, right? Because that's not exactly the the density that we were dealing with, which is UK like this, and then Bangladesh was like that. And another thing that might not sound very logical is like to work, and there was a question on how do we scale this when we're in project base. Well, first of all, get to project base to become a program, right? And the project base, we ignore a lot our admin and program colleagues, and this is what you need them, guys. Which is, if you're gonna hire a multidisciplinary team and you're gonna work with this implementing partner and this academic research, so you have an MOU, and as you were saying, Cash, maybe the procurement is not there, but maybe you can piggyback a framework agreement for another agency that already is working on that topic, UNICEF, for example, and then you just piggyback because they already hired that research institution, and that's faster to go on those things. Otherwise, you're sitting there like, oh my God, I have this thing to collect from the scratch, when you shouldn't, right? They also will help you with some of the things on the budget, how much the collection should be in, and ideas on how to, or like, do we do an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, or do we hire them as vendor to this university, right? These kind of questions that don't seem like logical. And this is how you usually scale. Sometimes you start with a project, but the project maybe in a scaling for a scaling out in theory of innovation, maybe you want to replicate that project in many other country operations or maybe at a regional level. So you start in a small, this is my innovation hat, and then you keep going. And if you're gonna scale deep, which is a bit on the scaling up on the scaling deep, which is you want the organization to adopt behavioral data science, then you need a merge of the divisions, right? It's the people that are working with the data and the servers or IT division, with the people that are doing the data analytics, with the people that are actually the sectorial workers, right? So that's something that when you create, and if you're going to institutionalize that, then it's more on a political coordination level for you to institutionalize. And then if you're not creating a unit, at least you create a program around it for all your health interventions, for all your education interventions, or anything that you're deciding. And that is the way that maybe you're going to scale it up. There's different models for scaling. So it depends if you want your project to explode and do it at regional, national, whatever, or if you want the organization to adopt. Can be done.
Great. Okay, so much to unpack here. So many different ways you can work in the UN. There's lots of questions coming into at different spaces to go. So there are questions on like ethics and how to do this, and how to make this more sustainable. But just, is there anything else our panelists would like to add about considerations you might want to give colleagues when it comes to thinking about behavioral data science? Anything else you'd like to elaborate on, or do you feel like you've kind of touched upon throughout our discussion in the way?
Just the responsible approach. And sorry, Kash, maybe you're going to say like the ethical perspective on that. Don't believe that you not understand and everything because you have the advanced data analytics thing. You need to be super humble and work at your local level, and then also work on the sensitivity. So we use a lot of data protection techniques for the data sets that we have, and then data sharing agreements for us to ensure that the data has been, and also that data has been consented to be used. So taking the opt-in approach, right? Consented to be used for doing either AI models, behavioral data science, etc. If you don't have that in place, then you're doing spurious. Beyond maybe your data is perfect, right? But you're doing spurious in terms of like ethical considerations and data protection that you need to take. You are dealing with human behavior. They're deciding to go back, to go to school, to go to the latrine, right? So that's something that is super sensitive. We need to be very sensitive about it when you're doing behavioral data science. I don't know, Cash, from your perspective,
Yeah.
other things.
I think 100% like totally agree with Rebecca there, but I will answer from the opposite side of things, which is definitely take all of that into consideration, and that is absolutely critical. But also don't limit yourself and just try things. Obviously, don't try things if there's like people that are going to be vulnerable to it, but definitely I think I think a lot of people are kind of shy to just trying to build things, and I think it's so like we live in an age where it's so easy to try and build things, and as Rebecca said, you have the University of YouTube where there's like tons of ways to learn things. So like I think just play around, like make up some synthetic data, just like do your own simulations of how these things might work, and yeah, just keep trying stuff.
And the final pitch, we're always looking for partners.
Yeah.
So if you're working on something that we might be interested in, we usually don't have money. That's the only thing. But pro bono, you can work with us. And then sometimes we prioritize some interventions, right? Obviously, in some cases, we need to do some procurement, as Kash was saying. But like we're always looking to partner up with local universities, postdoctoral doctoral students, with academic partners, with private sector companies, startups at the local level, and other UN agencies, because like the one in Bangladesh that I told you was not it was Young Global Pulse actually leading it, and we're like, we have all the data, what do you need? So it's working to maybe the partner that has the data. In the case of Judson that I was telling you in predictive analysis was FAO Somalia, who had it, FAO. Thank you so much, guys. So like look at your partner, they might have the data set that you're missing on the behavior.
For sure. I think there's lots there to unpack. I'm just going to drop again. You can drop whatever in the chat you'd like, Rebecca, in terms of how people reach out to you, or Cash, if you want partners. I'll put the behavioral science group there just in case anyone wants to join us. But if there's any resources, Rebecca, like how people can reach out to you. I don't know if you want to put anything in the chat. I can have to do it for you. But yeah, no, I think this is definitely something we hope to start with the conversations in Behavioral Science Week. You know, how do we explore this behavioral data science more meaningfully? I'll just put Rebecca's or the UNHCR innovation email in the chat for everyone.
We checked that one, the team lead, so please chat with us.
Yeah, so hopefully we can have some more conversations in space, and next Behavioral Science Week we'll have even more examples to share. Yeah, go for it, Cash.
Can I quickly pitch something?
Yeah.
So at UNICEF, we're organizing a 2 or 3 day conference in Florence in November on behavioral data science. Obviously, Rebecca will be.
That's so kind. Like we can also pitch you some amazing people. Yeah. Okay, congratulations, guys, on Italy. Great.
Yeah. No, this
is it hybrid? Hopefully, because we're ambitious person.
Yeah.
Great. If not, I escape with my own money. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. We'll find no way to get you there. Don't worry.
Yeah, amazing. This would be great. A great conference. So let's, whenever that's available, we'll share in the behavioral science group. But then also keep in touch with Cash and Rebecca. And hopefully this is an enlightening discussion. There's so much we could unpack here, from the different types of data, the different methods we use, to how we do it. But hopefully this gave you a sense of how to kick things off in your
and it's an area that will grow, especially because this is the era of behavior. A lot of the private sector companies are going for it, in case you haven't noticed, from generative AI. So why not we do it in a proper and responsible way in the UN, right?
Yeah. I'll leave it there with you. Final word for Rebecca. I think that's the best way to end off the session today. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining. And yeah, hopefully see you at more sessions throughout the week. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye for now.